So I wanted to bring up the topic of what happens when state protection is invoked in trans and queer people's names. And in the videos, there's a really great illustration by Talcott Broadhead called Trans State Pen, basically saying that if we build trans prisons, they're just going to be filled with trans people. And I think that there are two different approaches to this question that are really interesting. One is, given that trans people are the target of so much violence, there are calls for justice for these acts of violence that go unprosecuted. And so if we think of a case like Isla Nettles, what does justice for her look like if we're not relying on the state to give us justice? The other side of this question is someone named Mia wrote in and asked, what is the place of legal strategies, either being taken now or that can be taken to begin to reform the prison system and move away from the cycle of violence in which we now exist? Do you believe that legal strategies are the best way to create a change, or is there something else we can do to better reform?
These are some brilliant people on Twitter and Google writing in. I think this is, I feel really lucky to be able to have these conversations. I think for me, I have like a whole lot of sadness when I think about Isla Nettles, and I think about the 238 other trans and gender nonconforming people who globally were killed, and this is just documented over the past year. And I have an incredible amount of sadness that at a time when organizations, more mainstream organizations, have been championing things like marriage and the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So I'm thinking like a couple years ago, we had the highest rate of trans women of color ever being murdered, right? So the priorities of people who are supposedly acting in my name and other trans women of color's name feel really different than our lived experience. And that brings me to the question of justice. The Audre Lorde Project wrote a really great statement about Isla Nettles and what justice means, and I think I want to just amplify that and share a story. A few years ago, in 2008, a community member and client of the Sylvia Rivera Law Project was murdered in the Bronx, Tanisha Stewart, and it was like a really intense moment for all of us engaged in this work, or who knew her, who were in this community with her. And there was a really intense conversation about what to do next. And I think this is pertinent because our lives are continually being held as disposable, and we're constantly having to navigate really intense other forms of violence. So the conversation was, do we go after the media? The New York Post was saying the most emotional things about Stewart, and basically saying that people who are trans or low income or poor or doing sex work or other forms of survival work, it doesn't matter if we're killing them. And then also there was a conversation about, do we go to engage the criminal justice system, quote unquote, and hold this person accountable. And then there was another point that people brought up was, this is a person that we lost in our community. This is a friend of many of us. This is someone that we would see a lot of times. And there's such a sense of loss, and to engage primarily the New York Post or the person who enacted the violence on Tanisha Stewart or the criminal justice system, we're not saying no to that, but also we're not putting energy into her life and the relationships that were devastated because of this act of violence. And for me, that's what I feel like profoundly invested in when someone I know or have been in community with or didn't know has been murdered. And I can't tell you how many people I've known who have been trans and gender nonconforming, people who have been killed or died recently. Where I want to put my investment and my energy is into holding that person's life as valuable, and I don't find that going through the prison industrial complex is ever a way that, just like, not abolitionists aside, but like just experience, I've never found that participating in a court case or engaging in the NYPD to hold our cases seriously has been a way to hold and honor the life of someone who I knew or was in community with, or to repair or begin to repair the relationships from all those who lost someone through really intense forms of violence. I would say the flip of that is a lot of people look at the NYPD and the court system as a symbolic reminder of how invaluable and disposable they deem our lives when people are not held accountable through the NYPD or through their case being brought to trial. So it's not to discount that, because that's a real way that people gauge, well, is my life mattering to other people? But for me, I really can't imagine the state, whether it's the NYPD or the criminal justice system, offering some kind of way to repair the violence that has happened when someone is murdered, when the state and the NYPD is consistently my biggest predator, right? And is consistently making my life incredibly hard to live. So I think that, to me, is the complexity about justice around when someone is murdering a community member. It's the large, gay Inc. nonprofits that are doing nothing about the material conditions of our lives and have wholly other different priorities. It's the NYPD and criminal justice system that aren't actually invested in repairing the harm that happened to our community. And it's the redirecting of my energy and focus to the people who loved Sanisha or loved Islam, and who, in my experience, we need a lot of support in those moments, and that support doesn't necessarily happen when we're pushing for someone to be brought to trial.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like the point of our work is to be like, how can this never happen again?
Yeah.
And oftentimes, if it becomes about just getting one person behind bars, also like when a cop kills somebody,
right,
it's like there's a zillion other cops who are then going to come and kill people, or there's other, like, it's more, to me, it's like, why was this person so vulnerable?
Right.
Both because of transphobia and also because of, like, often that person was poor or doing work under dangerous
right,
conditions,
right,
or didn't have a place to stay or whatever.
Right.
And that's something we can actually work on,
right,
or isolate. I mean, I think
right,
isolation,
right,
like you were saying, is so central to why we're vulnerable to harm,
right,
or why we have a hard time getting out of really harmful situations. And so I think, that stuff is really important. I feel like I should briefly address just the legal strategies question. I think that a lot of the framework that, like, we use at SRLP, and that's been important to me in, like, my writing, is that in contemporary politics, we're often told that the main thing social movements should aim to do is change the law, and that should be, like, how we fix bad conditions facing marginalized communities. And usually that means trying to get laws to say that our communities are good and not bad, that our communities are victims and not perpetrators or not criminals, and that our communities shouldn't experience discrimination or violence. But laws that say that, like anti-discrimination laws and hate crimes laws, they're not enforced. They're just, like, the law changes what it says, but, like, the cops still do the same things, the shelters still do the same things, people are still broke. So a lot of what is the other legal strategy for us is that, like, we don't think we're going to win the things we really need only by getting a law to change, because the law itself is a tool of oppression, even when it says good things about your community. Right. It's being used to, expand the policing, right? Like the, Matthew Shepard, James Berg hate crimes law, which put tens of millions of dollars into local law enforcement in the name of protecting queer and trans people from hate crimes, when, as Reina said, the biggest perpetrator of hate crimes is that system itself.
Right.
So we start to see those kind of contradictions. So I think the framework that I use is, yes, of course we need legal strategies and legal work because our communities are experiencing enormous harm from legal systems, but the goal is not to get those systems to say something different about us. The goal is to dismantle those systems and support people who are in them right now. Right. So that means changing laws if it can decriminalize things. It means changing laws to try to get people out and prevent people from going in. It means getting rid of laws that make it really hard to get benefits or make it really hard to get housing because if you have a criminal record, or those kinds of changes are about improving material conditions so people can survive, and they should be done. That work should be done from a community organizing centered place, so that when you come to get legal services, you also get hooked into, if you're willing, work to get to the root causes, because the real thing that makes like material change is movements that include like millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people, right? And to have that, we need to be meeting people where they're at, providing really meaningful, immediate survival resources, and building together, like, what do we think the answers to these problems are? How are we going to agitate for them in little local ways, but connected to like broader movements? So like that's why for us, a trans movement is like deeply linked to a welfare rights movement, to a housing movement. These are all overlapping to immigration, resistance about immigration enforcement, to resistance about criminalization, and to a prison abolition movement, to anti-colonial movements. Like these things, trans people are in all of them. They all speak to trans movement speaks to all those movements. Like we're all doing all of that work together, because it's those broad movements, which I know are hard, I think, for sometimes for people in the US to imagine right now, because they've been deeply, deeply, deeply attacked here for the last 40, 50 years, particularly intensely. But those movements are what's going to change things, and legal work can be like an immediate tactic or strategy as part of those movements. But it's like about really backing up from that fantasy that legal work is like the center of the work to make change, because that's just not true.
Yeah.